that split. We're going to deal with them both together. The chapter deals with, or the book deals with them in a single chapter on the seed plants. And so what it will allow us is, since we took 2 weeks in lab to do what it's going to take us 1 week in lecture, we actually, for a little bit, will be right on pace in lecture and lab. And you're going to like that, but I want to tell you, it doesn't last long. It lasts for like 2 weeks, and then it's gone. It's like a fleeting satisfaction, and then it's gone, and it's a reminder to get your satisfaction in something other than your lecture and your lab, you know, correlating strongly. I don't know if that's where you primarily get your satisfaction anyways. Hopefully not. But just so you know, it will, for a couple of weeks, we'll be on pace, and then we won't. All right? Okay. So framing questions. Again, we're going to stop going through these slides at about 20 after 12. We're still going to do a lecture break. So I don't know how many of these we will get through, but we will attempt to get through the first 3 of these questions. What is the relationship between angiosperm diversity and insect diversity? And as we talk about this, we actually need to talk about the geological timescale. I've mentioned a couple of terms to you: Devonian, Ordovician, Carboniferous. We've seen some of these terms, and I told you that you weren't emotionally ready to handle them. You are now. You're emotionally ready to handle them. Even if you don't know that you are, you are. And so we're actually going to deal with some of those terms. And so we may not actually get past the first framing question, and that's okay. Next one: how do seeds and pollen allow seed plants to populate diverse ecosystems? And then the third one that we might get to: how would you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? And what this question is really addressing is, how do you differentiate between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm? Because a cycad is a gymnosperm, but you already know that, because the lab last week was on gymnosperms, and you had a cycad, and you're like, man, I already got that. I already got that. You're welcome. It's one of the benefits of our lab not being perfectly in line with our lecture. All right. So this first one: what is the relationship between angiosperm diversity and insect diversity? Okay. So far, we've talked about seedless plants. Would you agree? We've also talked about protists, but last week, I mean, just as far as our plants are concerned, we've talked about seedless plants. Okay, bryophytes, and then some of our tracheophytes, some of our vascular plants, but still seedless. And how does a male gamete, that is the sperm, get to a female gamete in a seedless plant? Somebody remind me, because it was a long weekend and I have forgotten. Allison.
Either swims or floats.
Either swims or floats, so it ties the reproduction of those plants still to water. Still to water, right? And so our seedless plants, the reproduction is still tied to water because the male gamete has to swim there, okay, or float there. Okay, and it can float in air, but it's way less efficient than floating in water. So I'm not telling you like a moss can't reproduce without water, because there are some cases in where it will happen. Okay, but like they say in Jurassic Park, sometimes life finds a way, right? It's not the norm. You don't exactly expect it, but man, if you're gonna put DNA of a frog that changes sex into a dinosaur, you ought to expect that, right? It's like, oh my gosh, it changed from male to female. Whoops. I guess it was female to male because they were all females, and then all. Anyways, sorry. Another story for another time. So what we find about gymnosperms and angiosperms is reproduction is no longer tied to water. Reproduction is no longer tied to water. The sperm get to the female gametes, the ova, through the wind carrying them there or animals carrying them there. And the animals, that's the interesting one, because what it creates is an opportunity for us to have what we call a mutualistic relationship, right? Where both species benefit, a win-win relationship, right? Insect benefits because it gets to go to the flower and eat all the nectar it wants. Have you ever wondered why flowers have nectar? Like why flowers are full of just this rich, delicious material? It's to attract insects. And so the insects go there, they get their fill of nectar, and when they do, they get pollen, those male gametes, and then they carry them to another flower, and they'll take them to the female reproductive structures in that other flower, and then that pollen, your male gametes, will get in, right? It's just so wonderful. But it gives us the opportunity to create a win-win relationship, a mutualistic relationship. And so what you might predict is that once we start finding plants that reproduce this way, we should start finding insects that feed this way. Okay? And this is exactly what you find. So both insects and angiosperms are more diverse in the Triassic. When you compare that, and again, I'll show you a diagram where all of this, but Triassic, anyways, it's an era. No, it's a period. Sorry, it's not an era. It's a period of geological history. Okay? And what you find is at the same time we start finding a lot of plants that reproduce using animals, we start finding a lot of those animals that feed that way appearing in the fossil record at the same time. It's so cool. It's so cool. Add to this even more, angiosperms are by far the most diverse plant group. I mean, there's no other group of plants that even comes close to the amount of diversity we have in angiosperms. And insects are the most diverse animal group, by far. There's no other animal group that even comes close to the amount of diversity in insects. And so we've got plants that rely on insects for reproduction, insects that rely on plants for food, and those two groups are by far the most diverse of their corresponding types of life. Right? That's some neat stuff going on. Got some neat stuff going on. Even if you don't realize how neat it is, I just want you to know it's pretty neat. So this is oftentimes put forward as an example of coevolution. And so I want to talk a little bit about what coevolution means. So coevolution is either what you would call an evolutionary arms race. So this would be like a hare and a lynx. A hare is sort of like a rabbit. It's not a rabbit, it's sort of like a rabbit. And then a lynx is a wildcat, okay? Wildcats, they love to eat rabbits and things like rabbits, okay? And so we think about an evolutionary arms race or coevolution, what's going to happen is the lynx are going to eat the slowest hares, right? Would you agree? Yeah. If you were a predator, you're probably going to eat the slowest ones because those are the ones you're going to most easily catch. Okay? And you may not be targeting necessarily the sick and the weak ones, like the old ones, that don't run as fast anymore. It just so happens that most of your successful hunts happen to be on the slower ones. So over time, the hare gets faster because the slower individuals disappear, right? So if you have individuals that aren't slow because they're sick or old, but are slow just because their genetics aren't as good as the fast individuals, over time the hare as a population is going to get faster. Do you agree? All right. And then we think about, okay, well, what lynx are going to be most successful at eating hares? Those that are fastest, right? And so the lynx that aren't as fast as other lynx, not because they're old or because they're sick, but rather just because their genetics aren't as good, they're not going to eat as many rabbits as the faster lynx, so they're not going to make as many offspring, and over time, the lynx are going to get faster. Do you agree? This is the idea of coevolution, an evolutionary arms race. The hare gets faster, the lynx get faster, right? But this also happens in these mutualistic relationships, when these organisms come to rely on each other for survival. They're not trying to get away from the other, they're actually relying on it. So we've got these plants that rely on insects to carry their pollen to other individuals. Okay? And the insects that rely on those plants to get a nice meal. And so the plants that are best able to attract the insects are going to make the most offspring. Right? That makes sense? And the insects that do the best job of finding flowers on these plants are going to have the most offspring, right? And so we get the same coevolution, but it's not an arms race. Instead, they're working together. They're becoming better together. Better together. They're better together. Okay? Right? Hold on to that idea. So angiosperms rely on insects for pollination, but they have to, at the same time, try to avoid being eaten by other insects. Insects that aren't interested in actually carrying the nectar from one, flower to another. They just want to eat the leaves of that plant. So at the same time that the plant has to attract insects to its flowers that can carry that to other flowers, right? That's only going to work well for insects that fly. There are other insects that want to eat them, right? So the plants are in an evolutionary arms race against the insects that want to eat them and are better together with the insects that help them reproduce. Right? It's so wonderful, right? A very dynamic, very intricate relationship that would allow a great potential for diversifying, getting different forms. That's the idea. That's the idea. What if I told you that virtually every single species of flowering plant is what you would call monoecious, which means male and female are in the same individual. Sexes are not separate. And the overwhelming majority of those flowering plants have both male and female structures in the same flower. So they don't really need an insect to reproduce because the pollen's already there right next to the female reproductive structure, and all it has to do is fall out of the male reproductive structure and it falls into the female reproductive structure of the flower, and they self-pollinate. So plants don't really need insects to pollinate unless they're going to cross-fertilize and not self-fertilize. So they really only need insects so that they can reproduce with other plants, not so that they can actually reproduce, period. That's a little bit more complicated of a picture, and now it's like, okay, well, is there some value? Are individuals that cross-fertilize going to make more offspring than individuals that self-fertilize? Right? Because that's really the question now. Because if the answer to that question is no, that individuals that cross-fertilize aren't making any more offspring than individuals that self-fertilize, then this whole idea of this coevolution between the plants and the insects, it's not quite as strong. Cameron, did you have something?
I did.
Okay, Allison.
Well, I was just wondering, even if a plant cross-fertilizes, what's to prevent that offspring from just self-fertilizing?
I don't know. Yeah, so, do you all know who Gregor Mendel is? Right, he did all of his work on pea plants, but he actually had to prevent those pea plants from self-fertilizing, and so he would go in and he would actually remove the male reproductive structures from all of the flowers before they started releasing pollen. Okay, so then he could, or the female reproductive structures from other flowers, and so he could control and only allow cross-fertilization. So what would prevent that from happening? Really nothing. Because if you're like, hey, I grow strawberries in my backyard and I've never once seen anybody in my neighborhood that has another strawberry plant, and yet my flowers turn into fruit, which you'll find out in a little bit on Wednesday, means that fertilization has taken place. And yet there's nobody else anywhere close that has a strawberry plant, so it can only be explained by self-fertilization. There's no insect involved, because there's no other plant individual involved. Now it's really interesting, right? So can we actually use this argument to explain why insect diversity increases at the same time that angiosperm, or is it really just a correlation and not causation, right? Angiosperm diversity increase, therefore insect. Chris. Is it Chris or Christopher or both, either?
You can call me either one.
Okay, I'll do Chris because it's
Okay.
one syllable. I like that.
Yeah. So is that true for all angiosperms,
That they're capable of self-fertilization? No, not all, but the overwhelming majority.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Cameron, came back?
Yeah. Are insects aren't subjected to one type of flower species?
Some insects are very, very specialized. They only feed on a single type of flower.
But for the ones that
Oh yeah, they'll carry pollen from one species to a different. That pollen can't fertilize the ova, so it's just there. It's wasted. Yeah, it's a failed attempt. So that's another complicating factor, right? It's another complicating factor. It really only works if one, cross-fertilizing is more successful than self-fertilizing, and two, that the insect that you're relying on only gets nectar from you. Right? I want you to store that up because we're going to have a lot of conversations about where do angiosperms come from. Is there actually great evidence that they evolved from gymnosperms or not? Here are some examples of angiosperms. They are just commonly referred to as the flowering plants. And I want you to know that sometimes the flowers are microscopic, which is really unfortunate because you're like, okay, I'm going to nail this whole angiosperm versus gymnosperm thing because if it's got a flower, it's an angiosperm, which is true, but sometimes the flowers are microscopic. I don't know. To me, that just, it seems offensive, right? It's like, I thought it was going to be so easy. But I mean, if you know that greater than 99% of living plant species are angiosperms, you can just always guess angiosperm and you're going to be right the overwhelming majority of the time. Unless, of course, the test is designed to where it's like, you know, a quarter each, right? And it's not just like, hey, this isn't an accurate representation of real life. This test is not to scale, right? Okay, so now the thing that you weren't emotionally ready for, but now you are, the geological time scale. All right. So here are eras. And there are basically 3 eras that you need to be familiar with and comfortable talking about. And it's the Cenozoic, which is our current era. C for current, C for Cenozoic. You're welcome. Mesozoic, which is the middle era. Mesozoic, M. Middle, M. You're welcome for that one as well. And then you have Paleozoic. P for Paleozoic. P for primitive. You're welcome. That one's not as easy, but if there are only 3 and you've got current and middle, right, you're good to go. Right? The P, you deal with that. Okay, so Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic are 3 eras. Now each of these eras can be broken down into periods. And here we've got the Jurassic, right? We're like Jurassic Park. The unfortunate thing is almost every species in that movie is actually a Cretaceous species. But Cretaceous Park doesn't sound as good as Jurassic Park. And is it because we've been conditioned? Or is it just something else? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question. But, so some things that we've seen so far. We've talked about Ordovician. And we've talked about Devonian so far. And we've talked about Triassic so far. And let me give you the context of where we've seen it in case you have forgotten. Okay, so Ordovician is the first place where we start to see plants appearing in the fossil record. Okay, this is where we start to find bryophytes, like mosses, and liverworts, and hornworts. And then the Devonian is where we start to find tracheophytes, like ferns, and club mosses. And we're like, wow, this looks convincing. Because what we consider to be our most primitive plants show up here. And then our plants that actually can live more isolated from water show up here. And then now angiosperms we talked about showing up here. This is exactly what you would predict if all of these groups of plants diversified from some original plant species. Yeah, Mika. Yeah, of course. I would love to. So our bryophytes start showing up here in Ordovician deposits. Our tracheophytes, like ferns and club mosses, start showing up here. And tracheophytes, these are vascular seedless plants. They are more complex than non-vascular seedless plants, right? They have a vascular system. They have roots, and a xylem, and a phloem, right? It's more complex. They show up later in the fossil record. And then angiosperms. Now we've got fruiting plants. And we'll talk a little bit more this week about what else that they have. And they can live extremely far isolated away from water. They don't need water to reproduce. I mean, not directly. The sperm don't have to swim in water. And they show up later in the fossil record. And you're like, man, this is so interesting, because that's exactly what you would predict if plants actually evolved from green algae and then diversified into all the plants that we have now. You'd expect as you move through time, you're going to get more complex and sophisticated forms. Now to the problems. We've already mentioned that green algae show up later than bryophytes do, right? We've already mentioned that. Okay? We've already mentioned that whenever plants show up, bryophytes or tracheophytes, and then now our angiosperms and gymnosperms, whenever they show up with an enormous variety all at once. It'd be like if you were looking at the fossil record and you start seeing like mammals that you would consider to be, I don't know, less sophisticated. And really, that's going to be biased about what you mean by sophistication. But you're seeing like small mammals, like a shrew, right? Anyways, right? And then all of a sudden, like you're getting something a little bit more sophisticated, like a dog. And then you get something even more sophisticated, like a primate. And they show up in the right order in the fossil record. But as soon as shrews show up, there's like 7,000 different types of shrews all at once. And as soon as dogs show up, there's like 7,000 different types of dogs. And they're all adorable as puppies, and then they get old and they tear stuff up. Ruin your life. Oh, man. Gosh, those will be good stories for later dates. And then primates show up, but when they show up, it's like 400 different types of primates all at the same time. And you're like, wow, this is kind of weird. I would predict that we should get more complex forms, but I would certainly not predict that all of a sudden when one shows up, we have a whole bunch of different types. Had those 7,000 different types of shrews come to be? Had those 7,000 different types of dogs come to be? The 400 different types of primates? I don't know. I just don't know. Okay? And so I told you you're emotionally ready to handle this now. I hope you feel confident and empowered because of your knowledge and my confidence in your emotional stability. Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Any questions about this? Because I will tell you this now, because I there's an unspoken question right now of like, is this going to be on the test? Right? I will tell you that you could, I'm not saying you will, you could get a test question where some of these periods are left out and you got to fill in what's missing. You could have a test question like that. You could also have a test question where it says, use the fossil record as evidence against or in favor of an evolution within a group. And so now you're not going to have to fill in what's missing, but you're going to have to communicate about when these things show up in the fossil record. You could expect to see a question like that as well. Yeah, Mia.
Which period did you say that the angiosperm showed up in again?
Yeah, so they show up, I'm going to say they show up in the Triassic, but put an asterisk next to that. And you'll see why in a little bit. Well, I'll give you the information to write after that asterisk. So, yeah, they show up in the Triassic, but with an asterisk. Yeah, Chris.
So is the fossil record one of the biggest negative evidences?
I would say the fossil record is the best evidence against plants sharing a single plant ancestor. Yeah.
What was the problem with that? Like you have one species, but then you have multiple, like a lot of them?
Oh, it's not one species, it's one entire phylum, right? So you have to think about the phylum Bryophyta, which is mosses, yeah. Right? That's equivalent to a phylum of animals, which would be like all mollusks or all arthropods, and I don't know what that means to you. but like it's even more than just all vertebrates. So all vertebrates would be like hagfish and lamprey, bony fish, cartilaginous fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. But it's even more than that. That's not even at the level of phylum. That's only at the level of like subphylum. And then there's more diversity in there of things that I don't know if you're familiar with. Tunicates or sea squirts. Same idea. And then lancelets. Okay? And so that one phylum, Bryophyta, is an equivalent taxon to all of that animal diversity. So this isn't like just like one species, but a whole bunch of, individuals of that species show up. That's a problem too, but not as big of a problem, right? But it's like 7,000 different species show up with a lot of diversity. And you may look at something, and to you may have a hard time telling one moss apart from another. That's because you're probably not used to it. But you probably wouldn't have a hard time telling a fish apart from a bird, right? It's because it's more familiar to you. All right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so here is a proposed phylogeny for all of plants. And what are some things that are missing? We're not going to have time for a lecture break. I'm sorry. We're going to have to finish here, but that's okay. Don't put everything away yet. I meant finish at the end of this slide. That was confusing. Okay, so what's missing from this phylogeny compared to another phylogeny we've seen so far? Okay, so so this is just Archaeplastida. So this is just one of those drawers in the entire file cabinet of eukaryotes, right? So that's one way it's different. Notice any other differences? Emily?
This has like solid lines.
Yeah, there aren't any dashed lines, which is like, we have an idea of what this ancestor looks like then, okay? So it's not as big of a mess as trying to build a phylogeny for all eukaryotes. We have a pretty good idea. In fact, we know with a question mark that the ancestor of green algae and plants would have been classified as a species of green algae. So not only do we know what it would look like, but we'd have a pretty good idea of where to find it. We'd have a pretty good idea of how it would interact with its environment and when it should show up in the fossil record, if you could fossilize it well, right? So that's what those solid lines mean. Is that what you were going to say, Micah? Yeah. Okay. Anything else that we noticed from this? Do you see any polytomies where one branch splits into a bunch? Just right here, where one branch splits into three. Everything else looks pretty clean. Which means that based on the structure of plants and the genetics of plants, there's a pretty large amount of agreement among evolutionists about how you would construct the evolutionary history of plants. Okay? So there's not quite as much uncertainty as there is with all eukaryotes, which makes sense because this is just a piece of it. It's just a piece of the whole eukaryote puzzle, right? It's like with eukaryotes, you're doing a 1,000-piece puzzle and none of it's put together, right? You've got all these 1,000 pieces and you're trying to fit them together. This is just like maybe 10 of those pieces. You would expect it'd be simpler. And it's 10 of those pieces that all have a lot of similarities, right? They're all, when you put them together, the face of a horse. That's the last puzzle I did, I'm sorry. That's the last puzzle I did. My kids, my kids love to do puzzles, and yeah, so I don't know, maybe that will shape your experience in this class or not. I don't know. We'll see. We get some good puzzle stories coming. I have some good stories. Yeah, I'm going to tell you this story, actually. It has nothing to do with my children. It's probably the most disturbing thing I've ever actually, I didn't see it, but it's the most disturbing thing anybody I know has ever told me that they witnessed. And it's not because it's pretty strange, but it's so confusing. Okay, listen. All right, so here's the deal. And this is on the recording, so you can listen to it over and over again. So a friend of ours was driving out of our neighborhood. And our neighborhood, it's like a big, I mean, it's a big neighborhood, and so but there's only one road in and out of it, right? So it's a horrible design if you have to evacuate all those houses in a short. Anyways, that's another story for another time. So there's only one road out, and it is a busy road. There's like 1,400 houses in this neighborhood and one road in and out, okay? And so a friend of mine is leaving the neighborhood, and the car in front of her, the driver in front of her is taking kittens, throwing them out of her car, over the hood, and trying to like run them over as she's driving 60 miles an hour down this road coming out of this house. Super busy road, lots of cars. What is even happening? And it's not just like one or two, it's like there's 7 or 8 of them. And she just like keeps lobbing them like hand grenades out of her driver's window. None of the cats are harmed in any way. It's like the most miraculous thing ever. The cats just skid down the hood, fall onto the street, and then she drives past them. And the lady's just going behind her, picking up all these kittens, putting them in her car, and while calling, I mean, it's just the strangest thing ever. And then so she stops the lady at a light coming up, and she's like, what are you doing? And she says, don't worry about it. They're stray kittens. They don't belong to anyone. They don't belong to anyone. It's fine. That's my story for you. Yeah.